the Protestant reformers had a certain perspective on the medieval system of poor relief, and I'm not saying that they were correct. Their view of almsgiving may have been significantly jaded and inaccurate, and Niebuhr's in the 20th century may be too. But to Luther's mind in particular, almsgiving was a horrendous means for poor relief for theological reasons. And the primary theological reason was that it was an occasion for spiritual pride. In fact, it was an occasion for works righteousness. He saw the medieval symbiosis between rich and poor as a recipe for earning one's own salvation, earning merit, the thing that he hated the most. The symbiosis in his mind was that the poor were perceived as the treasure of the church. And that language, that concept, goes back to the 4th and 5th centuries through the writings and teachings of St. Ambrose and St. Augustine. The poor are placed on earth to provide the rich for an opportunity to earn merit on their own behalf by giving alms to the poor. If you go back to the earlier church fathers like Ambrose, they actually talked about taking earthly money and investing it in heavenly treasure. And you do that by giving to the poor. By taking your own earthly goods and giving them to the poor, you're withdrawing money from temporal possession, your temporal account, and placing it in an eternal account. And there are, in fact, many verses in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, that explicitly say that that is what happens. Luther had a big problem with it. Because of that, the Reformers' accounts of taxation center around two salient emphases. One, a rejection of calculation of one's own advantage in the redistribution of resources that necessarily occurs in the provision of assistance to the needy. And secondly, a commitment to formulating social policies by starting with economic circumstances as they are rather than as they should be. And by that I mean resisting the temptation, they thought it was, of looking at poverty and looking at the poor and seeing it as a spiritual opportunity or as a spiritual lesson. In other words, resisting the temptation to read ought off of is. Resisting the temptation to say, there are poor people, there is economic inequality, there must be something good about that arrangement. God is trying to do something in the lives of the rich through that. To some extent, particularly in the Lutheran Reformation, there's a shift from that perspective to viewing poverty and economic inequality as something that needs to be addressed, a problem, a dissonance between what is and what ought to be. We know it should not be there. We know it should be changed. We have this human impulse to change it. We need to do something about it and stop spiritualizing it. So there were a convergence of reasons for a change in poor relief in the 16th century. I do not mean to suggest that the shift toward a more secular, more regularized, more tax-based redistribution of resources is the product of Protestant theology. I think that Protestant theology may have given an impetus to those developments in Protestant areas, but those developments occurred in Catholic areas, and there were Catholic doctrines that contributed to them as well. They also were contributed to by humanist doctrines. But the economic circumstances of the 16th century were such that I think everybody realized something had to change. Poverty rapidly increased as the population increased and as economic recessions began to occur more regularly. To give one example from the Reformation history, in John Calvin's Geneva, the population of Geneva increased by 75% during Calvin's tenure there. Now, that's an extreme example. A lot of it has to do with the influx of Protestant refugees from France. Calvin himself was one, in fact, fleeing persecution in France and finding themselves in Geneva. But it illustrates how pressing this problem of poverty and inequality was. At the same time, there was massive begging. Some of that had to do with poverty. Some of it had to do with the choice that mendicant orders had made, monks and mendicant orders had made, to live in absolute poverty, like the spiritual Franciscans. Needless to say, that was that choice did not find favor in Luther's eyes either, or in Calvin's. So in the Lutheran cities, Luther's solution was to turn poor relief over to the civil authorities. And this, of course, is consistent with the development of Lutheran theology in general. He felt that the church had taxed Germany mercilessly, and that anything would be better than continued poor relief dictated by the papacy. So he wanted each parish to just assume responsibility for poor relief. The parishes, the local parishes, were confiscating monastic properties right and left, of course, in the Lutheran cities. So initially, the properties that were placed in so-called common chests in the Lutheran cities provided an ample source of funds to relieve the needs of the materially needy. The first city that recognized, the first parish that recognized that eventually the confiscated funds and goods were going to run out was the parish of Leisnig, not too far from Wittenberg, where Luther was. It enacted an ordinance that actually provided for ongoing redistributive taxation. Each member of the parish, from peasant to noble, was directed under the supervision of the city civil authorities to contribute each year a sum to the common chest once the confiscated goods ran out, a sum according to that person's ability and means. Luther wrote a preface to the ordinance in Leisnig, in which he said that by talking about ability and means, and by talking about ongoing taxation, and by talking about placing all of this in the hands of the civil authorities, the true freedom of the Christian spirit had been restored. So it was kind of his model. Real quickly, I want to look at John Calvin and tax as well. Calvin pressed the givenness of circumstances even further than Luther did. He emphasized that the divine arranging of human affairs remains in obscurity. He reverted in many ways to the Catholic symbiosis, the medieval symbiosis. In fact, Niebuhr takes him to task on this point, says that his ethics did not depart from the Roman Catholic ethic at all, whereas Luther's did. So Calvin, being of course a theologian who emphasized the sovereignty of God to the extreme, emphasized the fact that every single thing that happens to the smallest detail is a direct product of God's governing providence, had to make a sharp distinction between the way things are and the command that God gives us to make things better. So the fact that God creates poverty and inequality, that is none of our business. That remains in obscurity. God's reasons for that are not something we can inquire into or learn from or draw any conclusions from. Our job is to follow God's command. So humans become caught in this almost Sisyphean task of responding to what are, from the human perspective, very negative circumstances, but from the divine perspective, divinely ordained, responding to those circumstances, like poverty, through God's command to do justice, to relieve the needs of the poor. And so there's just this ongoing tension in which humans dwell. And the place of politics, the place of ethics, the place of taxation is in that tension. That's what Niebuhr wants to get to in the 20th century. He wants to get to the point of showing that tax is how you bridge that gulf, how you take circumstances as they are, stop spiritualizing them, leaving them to the mystery of God's providence, and yet respond to them according to God's very clear command that justice must be done, that the oppressed must be rescued, and that the poor must be provided for as a central task of someone trying to live out the gospel. So Niebuhr enters this debate in the 1930s, starting with St. Augustine, because you always start with St. Augustine, you know. Yeah, where else are you going to start? He called Augustine of Hippo the first great realist in the Western tradition. And he interestingly says, this is without dispute. I'm not going to defend this statement. It's so obvious that everybody knows it. Anyway, what he means by realism is a school of thought that takes self-interest seriously, that takes the human proclivity to serve myself seriously. He called it self-love. Niebuhr much preferred the term self-love to self-interest, and in that he probably does follow Augustine. But at the same time, Augustine had a notion of sacrificial love. Sacrificial love is Christian love, the love that is willing and able to empty itself entirely of self-interest and focus completely on the other. Now, Niebuhr thought that Augustine was the father of both the Reformation and of medieval Catholicism, and he faults Augustine for that. He thinks that Augustine was too imbued with classical notions of reciprocity. I give so that you may give back. And therefore, that he set the stage for what Niebuhr called or what Niebuhr considered the theological deformity of medieval Catholicism on the question of love. What Niebuhr meant by that was that Catholicism, in creating a two-tier system of love, or a two-tier system of ethics, in which some very spiritual people are capable of engaging in true self-sacrifice, where others are not, effectively converted even the even the true sacrificial love of the councils of perfection, of the monks, of the nuns, converted that into a rigorous law that resembles too much the law that applies in the world, the law of the world, in which justice reigns, in which you have to do justice but not engage in true self-sacrifice. So, key to the dynamic in Niebuhr's Protestant, at least Lutheran conviction, that economic productivity, as necessary as it may be, stems from self-love, which is sin. The government uses tax policy to redress inequality resulting from unrestrained profit and wealth maximization in industrialized society. That is, the state seeks a measure of justice in the face of the givenness of circumstances, the natural inequality that results from economic activity. But the most that can be hoped for in redistributive taxation is a balance between what he calls the final moral possibilities, that is sacrificial love, and the given realities, that is the fact that societies have to generate wealth just in order for people to survive. There are really two dialectics, two tensions in Niebuhr. The first is the, the tension between mutual love, which he also calls justice, the love that says, I give to you so that you may give back to me. I contribute something to society so that society may give back to me, contribute something to me. The tension between that kind of love, which is love because it's focused somewhat on other people, and true self-love. So that's the first dialectic. That's the first tension. And he considers the effect of mutual love on self-love as an act of political pressure. And that's where tax is. The state has to exercise political pressure in the name of mutual love in order to correct self-love. And that's what he meant by saying that taxation is the balancing mechanism between the security of the individual, the well-being of the individual, and rampant profit maximization. The state comes in a capitalist society to take the goods that the capitalists are rapidly accumulating and redistribute some of them to individuals who would otherwise be completely and totally exploited by the capitalist system. How much time? 1 minute, okay. The second dialectic, though, is that mutual love itself is not strong enough to resist self-love, because self-love is the basic human instinct. It resides at the heart of human nature. So mutual love requires a dialectic relationship with truly sacrificial love. That is sacrificial love that takes no account of what it's receiving when it gives to another. Sacrificial love is a strictly religious phenomenon. It can only occur through the awe and humbling that happens in the presence of Almighty God. So without that second dialectic, the first dialectic will not work at all, because self-love will simply absorb mutual love, justice, as he said it did in Roman Catholicism, and as he said it did in social idealism. And by that he meant Adam Smith saying that enlightened self-interest is the principle that governs society. All right, that's it.